Yeah, and it's now live.
Thank you for that. Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome. It's now 9:30, and so I resume the further hearings of this examination of the North Hertfordshire local plan. My name's Simon Barclay. I'm a planning inspector and a chartered town planner, and I've been appointed by the Secretary of State to hold this examination into the soundness of the plan. Everyone should have read my my general guidance note and as well my special guidance note about the virtual hearings. Just though a couple of very quick do's and don'ts in relation to using Zoom. I won't be using the document sharing facility, and please don't hold any document or anything else up in front of the camera, and please also make sure that no one else appears on the camera either. Please don't share any personal information at all during the hearings, either yours or indeed anyone else's. On Zoom, the chat and reaction facilities shouldn't be used, and if anything is posted in the chat, I won't see it, and I will ignore anything that does get posted there. If you don't want your face to appear on the screen, that's fine, and you can keep your camera turned off during the hearing if you so wish. I set out in my guidance note what you should do if you do experience any interference or IT problems. In short, if all else fails, please do contact Mrs. St. John Howe, and she will be on hand to help out. You should have read as well the sort of ground rules, in terms of, what you should do at the start of each session and that kind of thing. But in short, really, if you join with your camera switched on, unless you don't want to have it switched on, but also with your microphone on mute, that would be perfect. So hopefully, as I say, you've all read my note, and that's all reasonably clear. As before, I will be taking short breaks in the morning and in the afternoon, and a longer break for lunch. So are there any questions about the use of Zoom just before we start? Okay, I can't see that anyone's indicating. I probably should have said, as the discussion goes on, and if you have a point that you want to make, if you would raise your virtual hand, and hopefully everyone knows how to do that. I can see a list of people's names, and I can tell when someone's raised their virtual hand. So I will know that you want to get into the discussion, and I will come to you as soon as I can during the debate. So okay, I'm now going to have just some very brief introductions before we start. And so first of all, then I'm just going to go through the list of people's names, and if people could just say good morning, that would be marvellous. So first of all, for the council, then I have Ms. Ormsby.
Yeah, good morning, sir. Thank you.
Good morning, and Mr. Smith.
Good morning.
Morning, Mr. Smith. For Hertfordshire County Council, I have Mr. See if I get this right, Prioetti.
Prioetti, thank you, sir. Yep.
Okay, yeah, my apologies if I do get that wrong again. I will try my best. For Barkway Parish Council, then I have Miss Vita of Gove Resources.
Good morning, and it's Gov Resources, sir.
A good start. Very
good.
Yeah,
never mind.
Thank you. And Councillor Dennis.
Yes, sir.
Good morning, Councillor Dennis.
Morning, sir. Yes, I'm here.
Very good, thank you. I have Councillor Morris.
Good morning, sir.
I have Mr. Aspinall.
Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Aspinall. I have Ms. Cotier.
Good morning.
Morning. I have Mrs. Norgan. Miss Norgan.
Good morning.
Good morning. I have Miss Hamilton.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning. For Newsells Park Stud, I have Mr. Riley of DLPB Limited.
Sir.
Morning. For Rand Brothers, I have Mr. Fletcher of Strutton Parker.
Good morning.
Morning. And also Ms. Cook of Town Legal.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning. And I think finally, for Save Our Greenbelt, I have Mr. Hawkins.
Good morning, Inspector. Nice to see you again.
Likewise, Mr. Hawkins. And yeah, I hope that everyone is keeping safe and well. Is there anyone here that I have missed? Good, excellent. Very good then. In which case, I will turn then to matter 30. That's Barkway and site BK3. I probably should say, yeah, look, so I'm taking notes throughout the hearing. So you may find that my head is down a little bit. I apologise for that. I will try and make eye contact with people as much as I possibly can whilst they're talking. On which point, when I'm making eye contact, my eyes are normally sort of looking slightly up, and hopefully that isn't too disconcerting. But that's because I have your images on a screen that's slightly higher than my head level. So matter 30 then, Barkway.
Sir, sorry, it's Mary Cook here from the Rand Brothers. Can I just interrupt with what and make a confession to you, because I cannot readily see, I don't know why, I cannot readily see my hands up function. And I just wonder if I can confess to that now rather than causing you a problem and interrupting later.
Yes, certainly. No, thanks for that.
Inspector, it might be listed under participants. If you look on the bottom index, sometimes it's listed under reactions, and sometimes it's listed in the participants box. There's a little arrow and it shows up in there.
Oh yeah, okay. Miss Cook, could you?
Can I just say I was expecting that, but it's not there on mine today.
Is it under reactions? There's a little round smiley face.
Could you,
Miss Cook, if you click on the actual participants rather than the arrow next to it, I think that may work.
Thank you.
Yeah, Miss Cook, could I ask you to do a practice then? If you could raise your hand now, and I'll tell you if I can tell whether it's raised. Yes, I can.
Perfect.
Yeah, I can see that your hand's raised. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, if a problem does become apparent, well, if it is a problem, it will become apparent because I will ignore you. If that does appear to be the case, Ms. Cook, then please do let me know via some other means. Okay, thank you for that. So matter 30 then, Barkway and site BK3. So as we know, site BK3 is a site in the plan as it was originally submitted. And just to be absolutely clear on this, that is the plan that I am examining. So it falls then for me to consider whether or not the inclusion of site BK3 in the plan is sound. So if I go to issue, well, I want to deal with the with site BK3 specifically first of all, and only once that discussion is exhausted to move on then to Barkway's place within the settlement hierarchy. So focusing specifically on site BK3 first of all. So yeah, site in the plan as submitted was previously proposed by the council to be modified, but now the council's stance in relation to the site has changed, and the council, in short, proposes to delete the plan delete the site from the plan, rather. Is the crux of this issue here, Mr. Smith, about the visual impact of the site? I mean, obviously you considered the site to be sound when you originally submitted the plan. Now, my understanding is that the council's reason for proposing the site's deletion now is about the reserve school site not coming forward, and the visual impact that housing on site BK3 would cause absence of a school on the reserve school site. Is that right?
Not quite, sir, to be honest. They're kind of consequential issues to our main concern. Our main concern around this site is the comparative is sustainability, both in and of itself and comparative to other sites in the plan, having regard to the fact that the educational arrangements in the village have now changed. So when we submitted the plan to you, there was a first school in the village offering education within the village for children from reception to year 4. There's a 3-tier system in operation here, and that was the position at the time you held the first examination session. Since that point, the schools in Barkway and Barley, which is the next village up the road, as it were, have federated, which perhaps is not in itself unusual, but under that federation, they've now changed the operational arrangements between those schools. So there's now a split of provision. So whereas there was the first school in Barkway, what happens now is the nursery, the reception, and year 1 are taught in Barkway for the 2 villages, and years 2, 3, and 4 are taught in the neighbouring village of Barley. So there's now a materially different level of provision than at the time the site was selected and when you first examined it. And that's really the crux of our concern. Oh. Flowing from that, and that's set out in ED 210 that we put to you. And flowing from that, you're right, there is a reserve school site held in the village adjoining to BK3. And obviously, in a scenario where that site came forward, then perhaps some of those concerns in relation to Barkway could be alleviated, because that might create a situation where there's a greater level of provision in the village, such that it's comparable to where we were when we started. But as it stands, there doesn't seem to be much likelihood of that happening. You'll see from the County Council statement that their view from an operational point of view is that there's capacity across the existing arrangement, but obviously that necessitates travel between the villages for that to occur. There's some uncertainty towards the end of the plan period, but it seems unlikely that reserve school site would be used. And under the current arrangement, that could cause issues in itself, because if that reserve school site was used under the federated arrangement, that could mean all provision being removed out of Barley. So we have now quite a different situation to when we first considered the site. I think, is that a fair summary, Mr. Prayati?
If you bear with me just a moment. Yeah, my apologies. So, yeah, you were talking about it's unlikely. You said that the reserve school site will be used, or at least there's doubt. You were pointing out a problem if it were to be used, and I didn't quite follow that. My apologies.
Because the schools are now federated, so you have this split provision across 2 villages. And Mr. Prayati may be able to assist on some of this operational side. my understanding is there's no realistic prospect of those schools defederating. They're diocesan schools. They're not under the control of the county council. And therefore, if the reserve school site was to be required under the current arrangement, it seems likely that that would involve the provision from both Barkway and Barley being consolidated onto that single site, which actually has the consequence potentially of removing all provision from the neighbouring village of Barley. So although it might solve a problem in relation to Barkway, it could create a problem in relation to Barley. And then flowing from that, to go back to your original point, obviously if the school remains unused, then there is then that question of what you do with this piece of land between BK3 and the village, which I know was a concern to you at the original hearings when it was sort of in there as white land, and in your view you were quite firm that any development on that should be plan led.
Just at the very top there, Mr. Smith, you said, well, to paraphrase slightly, that the issue was about sustainability.
Yeah.
Do I take that to mean about travel between the villages in motor vehicles?
Yeah, well, it will travel between the villages. As I say, there's only now, well, there's nursery reception in year 1 are in Barkway, and years 2, 3 and 4 necessitates travel to Barley, and that's a unique arrangement within the district.
Yeah, I just want because sustainability is quite a wide and all.
Yes, it is. It's
to be clear.
From the it's effectively educational sustainability. We've obviously discussed the settlement hierarchy and sustainability more broadly way back at the start, but it's a relatively narrow point.
Right. Okay. So that's the council's primary concern, you say, then, is it?
Yes, that's what's precipitated our change in position, and the issues around the visual impact really are consequential to that rather than being the driver.
Okay, is that also a secondary issue perhaps, but it is still an issue, the council says?
Yeah.
Okay, and that being what? That development on BK3 for housing in the absence of the school site would lead to housing that visually, you say, would be visually severed or separated from the remainder of the village. Is that right?
Yeah, that's the issue that's arisen. I mean, it's perhaps more of a development management issue in that that's come about from the fact that there have been applications submitted on this site while the local plan process has been going on, and it's kind of arisen as much from the council's development management function that on consideration of those schemes there is a concern around visual integration with the remainder of the village if you have this island site, for want of a better phrase, between it and part of BK3.
And in and of itself, Mr. Smith, would that visual impact be unacceptable in the council's view?
So absent any certainty about how the remainder of that land might be managed or used in such a way to overcome that concern.
Sorry, did you say yes?
Yes.
So in its own right then, you say that the visual impact would be, I suppose what I'm getting at is precisely what it is you're asking me to agree with you about, whether it's the issue about travel on its own, whether in and of itself that's unacceptable, whether it's the visual impact, whether you think that in and of itself that would be unacceptable, or whether you're asking me to agree that the combination of those two things leads to the site being unacceptable or unsound, and therefore shouldn't be included in the plan.
I think it's primarily the travel point. As I say, the initial concern is around sustainability, and absent a need to use the school site, there's then a consequential concern that if this was to proceed under the current arrangements. So I guess I'm saying in combination, but with a leaning towards the sustainability as the primary factor. I wouldn't say they're necessarily equal in the balance.
So what? It's a combination of the two things: the travel, the sustainability point being the weightiest of the two. But in any event, either impact in isolation would be unacceptable.
Yes, correct.
Do we know anything, Mr. Smith, or is there anything that you can tell me about the likely increase in travel?
I can give you some approximate numbers, and again, Mr. Prietti may be able to help here, or at least correct me if I'm wrong. The County Council work on an assumption for the purposes of this local plan that 500 homes generates one form of entry worth of demand. So that's effectively one class in each year group. And so on a scheme of 140 homes, as indicated here, that would generate approximately 60 students across all the primary year age groups, although in this part of the district, we're in a 3-tier system. So first, middle and upper schools rather than primary. And
sorry, 60 pupils across all age groups, is that primary age groups?
Primary, so yeah, reception through to year 6 on that ratio. Mr. Prietti, you've got your hand up. Are you perhaps going to correct me slightly here?
No, it's broadly correct. So we do use a ratio of 500 dwellings equals one form of entry. So for first education, that's approximately about 0.28 forms of entry, or 42 children. So if you broadly split that across the two school sites, that'll be roughly approximately 17 pupils going to Barkway and 25 pupils going to Barley, based on 2 year groups at Barkway and 3 at Barley, just in maths sense.
And sorry, what was the Barley figure there, Mr. Prietti?
25, approximately 25 pupils, and Barkway was approximately 17, giving a total of approximately 42.
Which those were exactly the numbers I had written down. So
okay. Did I interrupt you, Mr. Smith? Were you telling me more?
no, I was going to go through the breakdown that Mr. Prietti helpfully provided. As I say, luckily we have exactly the same numbers and we're on the same page on that.
Okay. Would that level of travel between two villages be particularly unusual?
Not necessarily hugely unusual. I think it's part of the issue here is obviously is comparative to other sites and locations we've got in the plan, and obviously you're going to come onto it specifically in relation to Greenbelt, in that all other places where we're allocating sites either have primary schools, so offering from reception through to year 6, or first schools, so reception through to year 4, in that settlement where the sites are to be allocated. So clearly we're dealing with a different situation here. And the significant majority of those, it's fair to say, are primary schools. It's only really the Royston and the east of the district, the rural east, that operates under this 3-tier system.
Yeah, I mean, I'm asking that question because some might say, well, indeed, some have said that you know, travel between 2 villages like this would be quite a usual thing if you look across the country, and there's nothing particularly unusual about children from one village needing to go to school in the next village down the road.
No, that's correct. And we've had regard to, obviously there's advice in the MPPF, I think it's paragraph 55, isn't it, that talks about facilities in one village supporting the population in another, or the population in one village supporting the vitality of facilities across more than one village. But I think it's a question of scale, really, in that Barkway was one of these 5 villages for growth, as they were temporarily called. We've now been asked to call them something different. But certainly of the villages for growth, if I can just use that shorthand for the moment, where more than 200 homes were proposed, then Barkway in educational terms always had the slightly lesser sustainability credentials, because it was the only of those villages operating under the 3-tier system rather than the 2-tier primary system. And now obviously that situation deteriorated slightly further. So in all those villages in the plan as submitted taking 200 homes or more, all the others have all the full range of primary education within that village, and that will remain to be the case because those villages have, they've got the schools there as they are, and they have policy criteria where necessary to support the continued running of those schools through expansion or potential relocations or so on. So we've got a very materially different situation here in Barkway when you look at it within the district. As you say, it's not unusual for facilities to support another village. And you know, to be clear, we're not talking about a moratorium on development in Barkway or Barley. I think between the 2 settlements, we're still, with the retained allocation and completions and permissions to date, we're still looking at around 80 or 90 homes across those villages between the plan period. So there is a level of development there to support that continued vitality, but its development at this scale is what makes us now uncomfortable to the point where we think you should consider its removal.
Ms. Cook, do you want to come in at this juncture?
Yes, please, sir. Thank you very much. Can I just begin by taking you back to the little chronology that we set out at Appendix 1 of our matter statements?
You can, but only if I can make it enlarge on my screen. Bear with me a moment.
Yes, of course.
Right, yes, I have that now visible.
Thank you, sir. I just want to use that as a sort of aid memoir for some points about dates, if I may. And also just to start by referencing the Housing and Greenbelt background paper, which is HOU1. I'm not going to ask you to turn that up, but in section 5 of that document, that is the evidence base, as I understand it, for the council's work into villages. And that's the source of their identification originally, that Barkway be considered a grade A village. And there's a table in there, and that table identifies the facilities in the villages. It's figure 10 on page 41 of HOU1 for your note. And it references certainly a school, but it does not descend into distinguishing between primary schools or middle or first schools. Indeed, it doesn't identify whether these schools are primary schools as such. Just going back to the chronology, and again, referencing the Ofsted report that we produce as part of our Appendix 4, what the Ofsted report, and in that chronology, sir, you see that Ofsted produced this report in February 2018, and it's my Appendix 4. But what Ofsted told us in that report was that that federation actually took place of these two schools in 2017. September 2017, to be precise. And it's quite apparent when you read the Ofsted report that in the beginning, each of the schools continued to teach independently of each other, which led to a situation which prevailed at the time when Barkway and BK3 was originally selected. That led to mixed classes, mixed age classes in Barkway. That was going on at the time the council selected BK3. It's quite obvious from the Ofsted report that it was for operational reasons that the head teacher wanted to separate out the mixed classes and move to a system of year groups being taught separately from each other. And that is what has led, as I understand it, to the way Barkway and Barley now operate. And that's seen as a positive in teaching terms. And as a matter of fact, and now I want you to just look at Appendix 5, and again, you don't necessarily need to turn this up, but let me give you the figures. We're told that there is capacity for 57 at Barkway, and there are 50 on the roll. There's capacity for 90 at Barley, and there are 32 on the roll. So if you put that together, sir, because these schools are now operating in a federated system as one, what that means is there is capacity. So I'm looking at a combined capacity of 147 versus a combined 82 on the roll. And that indicates that there's a capacity for 65, which, bearing in mind the figures you've been given, explains why, and perhaps demonstrates why, throughout this process, and when I say this process, my client first made an application for 100 homes in 2016, it's always been the position of the county council that there is capacity in the local schools for this development. There was capacity originally for the original 100, and there was capacity, and there still is capacity for the 140. I would like to just turn this round on its head and say there is existing infrastructure in these two schools which is not being used to its capacity, and we see the additional housing as a positive because it makes better use of that infrastructure and it secures it in the longer term. And that's something that the county and the district seem to, well, they disregarded it. It doesn't appear in their thinking. People are traveling from Barley to Barkway, and people are traveling from Barkway to Barley for a variety of reasons. They might be going, for example, to Barley to the school. They might be going to the shop. The people living in Barley might be going to Barkway for all the sports facilities. These are the everyday occurrences of people living in the villages. So we don't accept the point that on a proper analysis that this is some new matter which has suddenly come to the attention of North Herts. When they originally chose the Barkway site, BK3, they did it in a world where we'd already made a planning application for the 100 units on the western part of our site. If you look at our Appendix 2, sir, there's a plan which shows the public footpath, the bridleway coming down north-south through the middle.
If you bear with me a moment.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
So when I say we started off, we mentioned this in our reps, we started off making an application on that western part of the site for 100 units. At that stage, the reserve school site was as is a reserve site in the currently adopted local plan. And the fundamental issue that was being raised at that stage was that the development wasn't comprehensive because it didn't provide for the development on the eastern part of the field, and it didn't provide an access from through, as it were, from east to west. There were no issues being raised at that point about, as it were, the reserve school site. So as you know, just in terms of the chronology, my clients then acquire the land to the east in order to make this comprehensive application, and we do so. And when BK3 was first allocated, of course, it was in a world where, as you rightly observed in your original hearing, the reserve school site was white land. So I find it a bit rich for North Herts now to start throwing landscape back at us when they were perfectly content and considered it sound to submit the plan with BK3 and simply that white land. As I understand it, it was you, sir, who raised concerns about the white land, and also there were some representations from the parish council expressing concern about what might happen to that land if there was no school. But so to focus just at the moment on the council's principal reason, which is said to be that BK3 site is now unsustainable because of the 60 odd students, in fact it's 42 as I understand it, that would be traveling, it's 42 children who would be using the Barkway and Barley School. As you say, sir, or as you suggested, it's not a great distance. It's not unusual for journeys to be taking place between two village schools, and indeed two villages. And all of this has got to be set in the context that all of these secondary school children, whether they attend Barley or Barkway, are all going to secondary school in the nearest town. It's a not unusual situation in this part of Hertfordshire, where you've got a number of rural villages. Not all of them have schools. But in the context of children travelling to secondary schools, to King James in Royston, and to Barkway and Barley, because of these single age groups, we would suggest that actually the continuing feeding of pupils to this school is a positive, not a negative, and that positive far outweighs any issues about the travel, particularly given the numbers involved and the already, the travel that already takes place between those villages. Can I say something, sir, about the visual point?
You bear with me just for a moment. Yes, please.
Again, perhaps by reference to the plan that we submitted.
Is that your appendix 2?
Yes, so sorry, I should have given you that reference.
No, I have that.
So, sir, focusing first of all on the eastern part of the site, the eastern part of the site sits opposite a number of the sports and social facilities that Barkway boasts. I mean, this village is undoubtedly very well served. And in that sense, housing on the eastern side would be very well situated, very close to those facilities. And we're also talking about a site, of course, which is on the Barley side of the village. And even, sir, in a world where Hertfordshire County Council hang on to their land, irrespective of what you do with it in terms of the local plan, Hertfordshire County Council can nevertheless hang on to it, as it were, as landowner. There will still be good pedestrian links between BK3. And when I say BK3, perhaps I should say the Rand Brothers land, just to distinguish, because I find it slightly confusing. BK3 has changed. It's expanded, hasn't it, as things have gone on. But originally, BK3 was just the land, the Rand Brothers land. And as I understand it, BK3 has come to be, it's been suggested that it be expanded by main modifications. So I just want to be, I guess I might have made that point at the outset. As I understand it, main mod 388 and main mod 389 represent the latest North Herts District Council thinking in relation to BK3, and indeed some changes to BK2.
Yeah, I understand the point. If you want to distinguish them by just saying BK3 and the reserve school land,
okay, that's fine.
That would be the easiest.
All right. So my observation to you, sir, is that development on that eastern parcel could be well integrated to the village, given its proximity to those facilities. There are footpath links, both down through the bridleway and also a potential footpath through the access. You know from our representations, planning applications, the planning application for 140 has been made, and it's not attracted any technical objections from statutory consultees. And you'll notice, sir, that if we go then to the western part of the application, here we have the land to the north of some ribbon development, mill cottages, mill house. Do you see those marked?
Yeah.
To the north. We have a additional development on the west side, BK2. And I would suggest, sir, that when you look at BK2 and you look at that in terms of its relationship with the village and the village facilities, BK3 is just as good, if not rather better, than BK2 in terms of functionality, getting people easily walking to and from the facilities and getting them to be able to drive through to Barley to go to school, a shop, employment, without needing to go through Barkway Village, and indeed Royston, again, to the north, without having to go through Barkway Village. I mean, it's a cracking good site, which is why it was chosen in the first place. And this school is a complete red herring. The reserved site is a red herring, in truth. And it's perfectly possible, sir, for you to envisage, I suggest, with your expertise, a layout which can accommodate the allocated houses in a way which leads to a perfectly satisfactory integration with the village. And the field access to the school site, there is, I think, if you can see a little indentation just opposite a property called Trident House in Tallard. If you can see those names on your plan, you'll see the field gate. It's on the western.
I see that. Yeah.
That is the existing access into this land. That access will remain in a world where BK3 comes forward and Hertfordshire County Council continue to sit on their land. My clients are the tenants of that site. They can continue to access that site and farm it in a development world. And I mean, there's no evidence whatsoever that the county council are suddenly going to stop managing their land in a world where BK3 is developed. That's entirely speculative and it's without foundation. And you've got the assurance that this land is owned by a responsible public body. And BK1, sir, of course, is now developed. I don't know whether you were able to when you last visited at Barkway, but BK1 is now developed, and the road access into BK1 leads quite deliberately to the edge of BK1 into what might or might not become a school site. As I understand it, I'm slightly piggy in the middle here. I've got the county council saying they still want this reserved for a school site, and I've got North Hart saying they don't believe there's a reasonable prospect that it will come forward. That's as I understand the position between North Herts and the county council in a world where you decide that the plan was sound as submitted and BK3 should remain. One other small procedural point I just wanted to raise. In our representation, sir, and in our letter to you, perhaps I should just wind back, we wrote to you and you very kindly responded. And some of the points in that letter, in particular, a point about how this decision had been made, were addressed to North Herts rather than yourself. We received a reply on Friday afternoon. I was on leave on Friday, but a reply came through on Friday afternoon. And it wasn't clear to me whether you had or had not been copied in on that correspondence. No. So I would ask the district to make that letter available to you. And if they can do that during the course of the day, perhaps in a break, you could just take a quick look at that, because I would like to make one or two remarks to you, but I think it'd be better for me to do that once you've had the opportunity to see what they've had to say about that.
Yes, I'm more than happy to do that.
Okay, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you. Those are my observations so far.
Thank you, Mr. Fletcher.
Thank you, sir. I've only got a couple of things just to add to what Mary Cook's just said, but I think really just to iterate the distance between the two settlements. So I think the total distance between the two schools is a total of 2.5 miles. Obviously, the BK3 allocation, as Miss Cook pointed out, is to the north of the village and is actually only 2 miles from Barley School. In addition to that, there is a shuttle bus, I understand, that runs between the two schools that is put on by the diocese since the schools federated. So school children have the opportunity to travel between the two federated schools by a shuttle bus service. In addition to that, on the transport front, we've got a current outline application in, which is undetermined, but there has been recommendations for financial contributions towards sustainable travel, which can further address any potential concerns about travelling between the two villages. But I think, as Mary Cook pointed out, we actually consider the federation of the schools to represent an improved position. What's been absolutely clear to me from listening to some of the early rounds of the hearings, that elsewhere within the district there has been concerns about education capacity, and actually we've got a situation here where we've got schools that have got capacity to expand and grow, and in sustainability terms, I think that's extremely beneficial. I mean, the local plan within paragraph 13.44 in the main modifications version, it's not a main modification, but the text clearly sets out that Barkway and Barley sort of rely on each other in terms of facilities, and very much support each other, which in my view is very consistent with paragraph 55 of the MPPF 2012. And just to pick up on a point I think Mr. Smith was saying earlier, he was referring to this situation being unique in terms of the district, and I think it is unique in one sense, in that this is the only part of the district that has the tiered setup for primary provision. But I think it's also a key point, which I'm no doubt will come on to later, that actually of the villages for growth, Barkway is outside of the green belt, within the eastern part of the district, whereas the other settlements are all within the green belt. And actually, Little Wymansey, which has got significantly greater level of growth than Barkway, is a comparably sized settlement, and was also within the green belt.
Okay,
Cheers, thank you.
sorry, Mr. Fletcher, you went a bit fuzzy on me there briefly. Had you finished saying what you wanted to say?
Yeah, I think that covers it for now, sir. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Hawkins.
Thank you, Inspector, and thank you, Mr. Fletcher, for making the point that Wymondley is in the Greenbelt. Wymondley happens to be 4.4 miles from the centre of Stevenage, according to Google. And I understand, according to Google, that Barkway is 4.5 miles from Royston. The word Royston hasn't been mentioned too many times by North Herts District Council, but it is a sizable urbanised dwelling area where I'm sure there are a number of schools available to support any increased developments within the Barkway area. I'm particularly pleased to be here this morning to be actually talking on behalf of the local plan. As you probably are aware, Inspector, we have been presenting to you on a number of occasions the opposite argument, which is that we would like to see the protected Greenbelt protected. And North Herts District Council have been making several pleas, demands upon you to ensure that you waive the Greenbelt protection so that housing can be built. And quite honestly, you know, Barkway is an area that is not protected, has a sizable development to be installed within it, and therefore leaves us all slightly dazed as to whether or not the entire local plan could be sufficiently disadvantaged by the desire to remove what is a non-Greenbelt site from the local plan, when the arguments are so strongly in favour of building so many sites upon the Greenbelt. We would only sort of draw your attention to the fact that Codicut, with several hundred homes being placed upon it, also has a school issue, and so does Wymondley. And having been so closely associated with the Wymondley neighbourhood plan for several years, I can assure you that the school in Little Wymondley has an outstanding Ofsted report, but has absolutely no space to take any additional pupils. In fact, the developer for Wymondley hasn't even identified space, even though there's an outline suggestion of a school emerging in Wymondley. The developer hasn't even drawn the square on the map where this school might likely appear. So all I'm trying to do, Inspector, is to draw an analogy.
Just forgive me a moment, Mr. I need to go just a little bit careful when talking about other places within the plan area, particularly places where there might be development proposed through the plan, where people who might have an interest one way or the other in that development aren't here. Because today is about Barkway, and I understand that people want to make comparisons, and you know, those points aren't lost on me. I understand them fully well, but please, if I could just ask everyone not to go down the road of giving me detail about other places.
Well, you know, I think it's an important assessment to be made, and one that might be called upon in some form of statutory review of the plan, in so much that, you know, how can you consider doing one thing over here and something completely different over there? So that's the point, and I accept fully, Inspector, your point that you've made. So from that perspective, we have made our detailed points to you in writing, and I hope that you have had the opportunity to read through those, and we will obviously rest with that, given your concerns about mentioning other sites in the plan. Thank you for your...
Yeah, thank you. Just to reassure you, perhaps Mr. Hawkins and others, that you know, part of my job at the end of all this is to pull everything together, as it were, to look at the plan and all of the evidence that I've been given in the round. So yeah, I take on board I do take on board the comparisons that you're making, and that will be something that is in my mind when I'm looking at all of this.
Well, thank you very much for that. I'll make some points later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Hawkins. Ms. Hamilton.
Hi, Inspector. The majority of what I'm going to say will be in relation to your question 30.4c, but just as well, I'm slightly confused. I'll use this very brief. Yeah, there's lots of sites that have educational issues. GA2 has doubled in size because of the reserve site that was needed, you know, because obviously, like when you have developments, it's like, oh, well, if you have these amount of developments, you need a primary school. If you have these amount of developments, you need a secondary school. So there was a reserve site put into another area, which is now not going ahead, but that seems okay. And I just wanted to clarify that in regards to other sites, one that we've spoken about before, again, how can they think about removing a site due to the sustainability travel when to develop another site in the plan, you're looking at an average of 3.7 miles for children to get to a secondary school, and that's okay. And yet they're looking to remove BK3 because a child has got to travel a distance of 2.4 miles. And yet we're now raising alarm bells, and maybe this site should be removed because, oh no, 2.4 miles isn't, you know, that's not very good sustainability wise. Is that sustainable? Well, we don't consider having to drive sort of 3.7 miles, 4 miles for loads of other children in other areas to be sustainable. But, you know, it raises that question. That's just the point I wanted to make right now. It doesn't really make sense why they're looking to remove this one because of sustainability travel. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Councillor Morris.
Thank you, sir. I'd just like to clarify a few points that Mary Cook made. The 2016 application, hostile application, was withdrawn and it was actually prior to that it was recommended for refusal. That's obviously on file. Barkway Sports Facilities is actually facility. There are a couple of football pitches. There's certainly not. There aren't comprehensive sports facilities in Barkway. The bridleway that splits the east and west of BK3 is actually also a green route. So I'm not entirely sure how that's going to work in practice. Also, traveling to Bali for employment. I'm not aware of any significant employment in Bali. There are a couple of pubs. There's a car repair shop that employs 3 people, I think. There's a garage that employs a family, and that's about it. And also, where we're talking about using the existing access onto the field on the west side of the site, of course, it's a little bit different having access to a field for agricultural use, which would obviously be occasionally, and actually access for 100 or so houses. And my last point on environmental safety or sustainability, it's not practical or safe to cycle or walk between Barley or Barkway. I mean, you do have to go by car, and that's about it. I mean, I've done everything, and it's not really safe on a regular basis. They're just my points for clarification at this stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Morris. Mr. Aspinall.
Thank you, Mr. Barclay. I've just one or two questions, really, as an against an opinion. As I understand it, there are 82 students on the roll of these two schools. Could somebody answer the question of whether all the children in those 82 are indigenous to these two villages? The second question is to the Hertfordshire County Council. Does Hertfordshire County Council go along with the idea that there be a school in both Barley and Barkway, or is it their overall policy, bearing in mind funds and the digital age and all this sort of thing, to over the next period of this plan, this local plan, to merge these two schools and thereby put one of these schools up for possible building land? 3, is the site BT2 and BT3 currently in the settlement boundary of both these villages? And 4, I wasn't quite clear when Mr. Hawkins referred to the fact that Barkway, the land, I guess, where these are to be developed, where these houses are to be developed, he said it was not protected. In other words, it's not in the green belt. Is it therefore in the area beyond the green belt that applies? Because this has a major impact on the whole local plan in terms of the whole strategic line, which no doubt we'll be discussing later on. But those questions would help me to consider what's going on here. As you know, I'm in favour of building, and it has to fulfil those rules of achievability, accountability, and achievability, whether it can be built now or whether there is the sustainability. And I haven't heard anybody say that those 3 items cannot be covered. But I'd like the answers to the questions, and I really would like the answers to the questions, not a fudged answer.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Aspinall. Ms. Vita.
I'm trying to take my hand down. It's gone. Okay. Yes, thank you. I think we seem to have gone down a bit of a rabbit hole. This isn't actually an educational issue. It's not about supply of education for the residents of Barley and Barkway. It's very clearly a sustainability issue, and as North Herts have said in their submission and previously, it's an urban design issue. It's a lack of being able to incorporate a development that is beyond the settlement with a big space in between it into what is at the moment a really cohesive community. So I think sustainability here, which was mentioned very early on by Nigel Smith, is very important, and it's not sustainable environmentally, economically, or socially. So the other thing is a lot has actually changed. I know Mary Cook was saying, you know, this is what was originally proposed, but things have changed. Barkway now have a neighbourhood plan that's just finished its first statutory consultation. They've done a massive amount of consultation. They know how the village feels about BK1, BK2 and BK3. There isn't an issue with BK1 and BK2. There is a big issue with BK3. So in the neighbourhood plan, their objectives of preserving character, ensuring good design on infill, preserving views, supporting local businesses and having a cohesive community are really important now. So environmentally, in the neighbourhood plan, we have a protected view across BK3. It is a beautiful rising green slope, which then flows into Newsall Stud beyond. Economically, the Stud is the biggest employer. We're worried about the continuation of that. And socially, this issue about community, it'd be very difficult to include the people that could potentially live in BK3 into the community because it is so far from the rest of the village. So I think it's important not to just think about education provision within Barley and Barkway. I don't really think that is the point being made by North Herts. The point is that the reserve school site isn't needed for education, and therefore the reserve school site stays green. So there's no justification in urban design terms for a development beyond that school site. I think those are my main points. Thank you.
Ms. Norgan.
I just wanted to challenge the North Hertfordshire District Council's previous statements on housing need and their comments that there is acute housing need because of BK3 being brought up again today. I've had a look at the density of that particular site, and the density, but it's 7.6 hectares, and it's only 140 houses compared with NS1, that's 900 houses. The particular density of BK3 is only 18, and that's incredibly low. And in fact, on the whole local plan, on the greenbelt sites, the density is 18.7. If the council really had an acute housing need, they would be not removing sites, but they would be building at a higher density. And that's the point I wanted to make in particular, to refute their stance on taking 140 houses out of non-greenbelt sites.
Thank you. Mr. Riley.
Thank you, sir. I just wanted to make sort of two brief points, please, because I think a number of the points that I was going to make have been covered off already. One is that, and I'm sure you'll obviously come on to this because it's one of your questions, is around the nature of the need for this reserve school site to deliver an education premises, and our evidence to you that it is not required. And it seems clear from the discussion and some of the information that's been put across that it won't be required to deliver a school as part of the development of Barkway and Barley as part of the local plan. So that's one point that's come out clearly to me. The second point I wanted to make is around this issue of sustainability. In our representation to you for matter 26, I think it was, when this was due to be heard, or part of this was due to be heard in last March's hearing session, we put forward a number of points around the sustainability of Barkway, and I don't propose to sort of go through them all to you now, sir, because they're in our written notes. But what we did draw your attention to there is the council sustainability appraisal, and what that said about the sustainability of Barkway. The council's own essay, which is the core document LP4 or document reference LP4 rather, sets out that Barkway fails a number of the essay objectives in particular objective 2c, which is to deliver more sustainable location patterns and reduce the use of motor vehicles. It seems to me that this goes to the heart of one of the issues that's being discussed here, which is the sustainability of this site and how it would contribute to that objective. So I would like to highlight that point, sir. And just on the point of sustainability more widely, as we've set out in a number of our written representations, the development of this site would have, in our view, an adverse impact on the sustainability of the settlement as a whole, in particular through the potential for the impact on the New Sales Park stud. Again, I don't want to labour that point because I know you've got a lot of correspondence on it, but when one is considering that, I think that does need to be taken into account. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Riley. Mr. Hawkins.
Thank you very much, Inspector. Yes, leads me to the point that sustainability, Barkway is one of 5 villages for growth. 4 of them have sites all within the Greenbelt, and Barkway has no sites within the Greenbelt. And the argument that I'm putting forward here, that North Herts District Council are suggesting that it's very difficult for them to release the growth villages because they're so important for their 5-year housing plan, yet here they are wanting to release housing options, not in Greenbelt, but still within the villages for growth. So I think that's the important part to get our heads round. Wymondley had the first neighbourhood plan in the whole of Hertfordshire. And we all know how important or relatively unimportant they are in the scheme of local plan development. And I would just make that point with regard to what was said from the parish council's perspective of Barkway. We are all trying to accommodate housing across North Hertfordshire in the most appropriate way and places. And, we are here not tree huggers, we are here trying to protect the importance of Greenbelt in the areas where they exist. And we cannot come to terms with the fact that releasing homes in non-Greenbelt space, there is any greater justification than releasing homes in protected Greenbelt space. So that's the point I'd like to make. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hawkins. Okay, I'll hear then from Ms. Cottier and then Ms. Hamilton. If everyone else could just keep their hands down for the time being, because after hearing from Ms. Cottier and Ms. Hamilton, I'm going to take a break. So, Ms. Cottier.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm not sure why the Barkway site is being handled so carefully and being given this red carpet treatment. And although I was listening to what Mosquito was saying about the neighbourhood plan consultation has yielded insight into how the residents feel about this particularly nice field, and I think that their input is really important for producing the neighbourhood plan, and they are, after all, and I'm a big advocate of locality and for people to say what's going on in their immediate area. So I appreciate what she says there, and I think that things like that should be taken into account, but not only in Berkeley, it should be applied to other places as well. I was looking earlier at what Nigel was saying in his Mr. Smith was saying in his representation, and he said that, I'll quote, "These are unique and very specific circumstances relating to schools provision in Berkeley that are not replicated at any other location in the district where development is being proposed." But that's simply not the case. So I'd say no, they're not replicated, but in fact they're trumped. The BK school in some respects is the least of his worries. So I'm not quite sure why he's handling this particular issue with kid gloves and then trampling with hobnail boots over every other issue that other places have. And I think it just needs to be a bit more uniform, because there's an incoherence in applying such specific care to one place, but yet not doing that plan wide. So it probably would need to be. He said in his earlier in ED 210. He says a chain of events has raised a question in my mind over the continued allocation of the site. Whilst having questions and a chain of events being started in his mind is a good sign, we'd like to expand that outwards into other areas as well. I don't necessarily have a particular interest in the Barkway site one way or another, but I attended today simply because it seemed a bit strange that this one place was being fixated on, whilst lots of other equally serious material considerations in other places were being ignored. So that's what I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Hamilton.
Yeah, coming on from what Miss Cotier said, like, while we fear for residents of Barkway, and they might have a very nice little area that they don't want developed on. Can I just point out on behalf of like all the other communities in this plan, we've all suffered. The residents of Stevenage had to put up with Great Ashby being built on their greenbelt land that was around the edge of that. That's gone to Great Ashby. We're already looking at GA1. And now we're looking at GA2. We've all got sustainability issues in regards to the lack of employment and everything else. And unfortunately, for some of us, we've properly been trampled on, because whereas some of the little villages have been able to do these neighbourhood plans, the poor old residents of some areas, like take Stevenage, for instance, they pushed to see if they could, with some of the residents of Great Ashby, get a community asset put on the sort of land that covers GA2, but they couldn't because it was already been put forward for the local plan. And unless the community councils say, yeah, we're going to do a neighbourhood plan and look into doing a neighbourhood plan, the rest of the residents and all the residents of sort of that area of Stevenage and the rest of the residents in Great Ashby already, they're screwed. Like, I should imagine with Luton, we'd all like to have neighbourhood plans in. So as much as I appreciate that, hey, if we could have all gone ahead with a neighbourhood plan or getting land put as a community asset, we would have done. So we do feel for these people, but at the end of the day, we've all suffered a loss. That's what I'm trying to put out. And at the end of the day, we now must follow in line with what the government's latest wants are, and that is trying to protect Greenbelt now. That's, and rejuvenating towns, brownfield sites and all this, and I think we all have to put up with a bit of loss in these times because development is needed. So that's what I just wanted to point out. Thank you, Inspector.
Okay, thank you for that. As I said, I'm going to take a break now. If I can ask everyone during the break, when I do adjourn in a moment, if you can, don't leave the meeting, stay in the meeting, but if you please turn off both your camera and your microphone, because if you don't, we'll all be able to see and or hear what you're doing during the break. So I make it 10:53. Adjourn the hearing to resume at 11:30. Thank you. Okay, it is now 11:30, and so I resume the hearing. Right, so I've heard quite a number of points from a number of different people. I want to give the council now an opportunity to come back on those points, and perhaps particularly Mr. Smith, the points about, well, it's not that far anyway, and in any event, there's a shuttle bus. And what, in the council's view, those two factors have on the point about sustainability. I can see Ms. Cook's hand has gone up. If that's about the letter, Ms. Cook, I don't know if it is. It's not. Ms. Cook.
I'm just hoping, sir, you'll give me a chance on behalf of my clients to say a few things in reaction to some of those who have spoken in support of the council's change position. Yeah,
and I had in mind in any event, Ms. Cook, to come back to you because I have now just about had time to read through the letter and the other things that were attached with it. So I will come back to you.
Yeah. So just before you turn to the council, it might be better to let Ms. Cook make any points that she wants to make in response to those that support the council, and then the council to sort of wrap up in the usual way. And then obviously we can deal with the letter as a separate matter, but usually so you do give the council the last say on this because it is their plan.
I think you've quoted me almost directly there, Ms. Ormsby.
Except, Ms. Ormsby, if I may say so, the council is now fighting against its own submitted plan, so it's not a typical situation, is it?
Well, we've discussed many main modifications to the plan, and that's the approach that the inspector has taken. So I would suggest that he would take the usual approach to this.
Okay, that's it. As long as Mr. Smith is content, I'm just conscious there have been a number of comments, but I can see, I think that Mr. Smith is content for me to do that. So, Ms. Cook.
Thank you very much, sir. I'd like to try and sweep up, if I may, some points that Councillor Morris made, as well as some points that Ms. Vita made, by directing you towards the neighbourhood plan, sir, which I do not think you have been made aware of. We're not convinced that this is part of the evidence base, but it's been referred to, and I think it's helpful in a number of respects. Just dealing with some factual points, sir, if I may. Councillor Morris suggested that really all Barkway had to offer was a couple of football pitches and a green. Well, sir, that is not the case. There's an awful lot more to it. And if you were to just take a moment to look at the neighbourhood plan and to look at policy BNL4 in the neighbourhood plan, you will find there a list of protected recreational spaces, and that includes the recreation ground, which includes the football pitches and a children's playground. It references a communal area behind Windmill Close, allotments, the cricket ground, Barkway Stud, the golf club, the golf driving range, the clay pigeon shooting range, and a fishing pond. And there's also another policy, BNH5, which calls for financial contributions to improve walking and public transport between BK3 and Barley and Royston. The plan in its current form takes note of BK3 and works on a BK3 world. And just again, picking up on a point that Ms. Vita said, and I noticed that she says it's not an educational issue, which of course is directly contrary to the North Herts' apparent primary reason for seeking to remove BK3. But she also made reference to protected views, and so there is a policy BNE4 which identifies priority views. There are 12 in total. 2 of those are views out of our site from the northernmost 2 points on the northern boundary of our site. One is a view from the village hall to the east of our site across some unregistered land. You'll see, sir, if you haven't already, to the west of the village hall, there's a small parcel of land, and the priority view is across there into the site. So there's nothing in the priority views which is inconsistent with the allocation of BK3. And of course, a number of the facilities that you will see identified provide jobs. And the neighbourhood plan is not just covering Barkway, it's covering Nut Hampstead to the south, which is an area which also provides jobs. There are a couple of industrial estates there. And again, they're referenced in the plan. So those are just, I think, some useful factual matters that I wanted to come back on. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Would it be helpful, Ms. Cook, to pick up on the point that you wanted to raise about the letter now? I'm not sure, because I'm not quite sure what point you want to make.
I'm very happy to do so, Sarah. I don't want to make a meal of it. But one of the things that we questioned right at the outset in our letter dated the 27th of November was a point about trying to understand exactly who and how this decision had been made to remove BK3 from the plan. And in their response, the council indicate that the decision was made by Mr. Fullstone, who's the regulatory director at North Herts District Council, and they are relying on the delegated powers out of the April 2017 meeting, and they reference ORD1. And if you'll just bear with me for a moment, in the electronic version of ORD1, and again, I don't ask you to get this out, but just for your note, page 68 of that electronic version is where the 11th of April 2017 report starts. And if you look at 10.8 and 10.9, you'll see there explained that the submission and adoption of the local plan is a matter for the full council. And that, sir, is the result of Regulation 4 of the Local Authority, open brackets, Functions and Responsibility, close brackets, England, Regs 2000. You can't have officers using delegated powers to make decisions about land that comes in or land that comes out of a local plan. You can only have full council doing that. I thought I'd alerted the council to that point in my letter when I referred to the Harrogate case, because that was an issue that was explored, Regulation 4 was explored in that case. So I just want to make that point. It may be of no consequence to you, sir, because as you rightly observe, you are now charged with examining the soundness of the plan as submitted. And it seems to me the onus is on the council now to demonstrate to you that the plan as submitted with BK3 in allocated for housing is unsound. Not for me in the usual way. So it's a sort of procedural point. And it's also just interesting to see that when one is dealing with a delegated decision, you usually have...
Do forgive me, Ms. Cook. Yeah, Mr. Aspinall, I don't. Can you hear me, Mr. Aspinall? Yes, you were sort of showing me a document there. I think entirely accidentally, but if you could make sure that documents are kind of kept away from the camera, please, I'd be grateful. Thank you, Ms. Cook.
I thought Mr. Aspinall was just trying to put me off my stride, sir. Just to come back to the second point I wanted to make, when you are seeing a delegated decision, that decision is usually evidenced by a report which is dated and signed by the decision maker, and that evidences the reasons why the decision has been made. In this case, we have no such thing. We simply have a 2-line email which begins "happy to support" from Mr. Fullstone. And sir, I think the council have been misguided in their attempts to remove BK3. And I think that Mr. Fullstone's purported exercise of his this delegated authority is unlawful. But as I say, that may or may not be a matter that has to get dealt with further down the line.
Yeah, just sorry, I'm getting some sort of feedback or something from someone. That's better. That stops now. Ms. Cook, just so I'm absolutely clear, do you say that causes me any sort of problem in terms of my consideration of the plan's soundness through this examination?
No, sir, because in a nutshell, no, it doesn't affect you and your ability to decide.
Right, okay, I've got a number of people with their hands up. I'll take those points, but then I do want to hear from the council and move along. So I'll hear from Councillor Morris.
Thank you. So just a couple of points. I'll be very brief. It's of course an emerging local plan. It's not an adopted local plan. That's presumably why we're here to discuss an emerging local plan. The sports facilities, as Ms. Cook mentioned, the golf club is actually in Nuthampstead, not in Barkway, probably a couple of miles away from Barkway. The shooting ground is on the other side of Nuthampstead. It's actually outside Nuthampstead, probably 4 miles from Barkway. The employment in Nuthampstead, there's virtually no employment in Barkway. Employment in Nuthampstead is perhaps 20 people, I'd have thought at most. And my last point is, Mr. Hawkins was talking about, obviously doesn't like building on Greenbelt. And I would say, because it's not appropriate to build houses on Greenbelt, which I actually agree with him, I actually support that, it doesn't mean that it's appropriate to build houses in another location, which the council and many others feel are inappropriate. They're the points I'd like to make, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Fletcher.
Thank you. Just 2 points, if I may. The first one, just to pick up on a point that Councillor Morris said first time round regarding access between Barkway and Barley. I think we've heard about the bridleway that runs directly through the BK3 allocation. If you follow that north, that does provide very good off-road and safe access between the two villages. And secondly, just picking up the point around employment in Barkway, again, if you look at policy BN-L1 of the emerging neighbourhood plan as referenced by Ms Cook, that does set out some of the services both within the village and Hampstead, but also to point out, obviously, the site is to the south of Newsall's Park Stud, which we've heard is a big employer in the area and would be the closest site to that allocation. In addition, there are, as set out again in the neighbourhood plan, a high percentage of people both self-employed and employed in agriculture. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fletcher. Ms. Vita.
This is very quick, and I'm sure you're aware that if we were to move forward with our neighbourhood plan, which we have done, and I was the consultant on the neighbourhood plan, we had to take account of BK3 because it was in a quite advanced emerging local plan, and it is a strategic policy. However, there is text throughout the plan, including paragraph 3.2.8, that says we will continue to reinforce our objection. And of course, at this point, we can amend our plan before submitting under Regulation 15.
Ms. Alton.
Yeah, hi. Why I totally respect the guys for standing united for Barkway. I just want to point out, I know Barkway, I know Barley, I know most areas in Northern Herts and East Herts. I've spent a lot of time looking at a lot of the sites, and I just wanted to, firstly, I've got a question to Newsall's. Newsall's is renowned, it's known internationally, it's a racehorse stud farm. They do employ some people. My question to, I think it's Andrew, was like, why would just 140 homes, considering poor old Stevenage is looking at 8,000 homes under 3 different authorities, why would 140 homes be such a negative impact on a place such as Newsall's? And going back and looking at the whole bigger picture, there are other sites also that have got less employment than that area, because I don't know who was saying it, I think it was the councillor maybe saying it. The golf club isn't that far from Barkway. I would say it's about a mile. And if you look at some of the other sites that will have less employment within a mile distance, or even a couple of miles distance, there are other sites that are going to have less employment opportunities. So I do think that we need to sort of look at, like, ignore this whole, like I said, this whole neighbourhood plan. There's lots of people that would like to do neighbourhood plans, but unfortunately they come under different parishes. And so, like, unless a certain parish wants to go ahead, so standing for, say, I don't know, residents of Stevenage and Ashby, because I know that area, like, they can't go ahead with the neighbourhood plan because it's under the Western Parish County. Ashby is under Western Parish. So unless Western take a neighbourhood plan forward, there's nothing they can do. So I just think we need to sort of like be wary that, like, to be fair in a local plan to all these communities. I mean, they're all communities that live within North Herts, and employers and residents and everything. And I do think this needs to be seen to be sort of like fair, and everything could be taken into account in regards to this. And I mean everything, all the different aspects and everything else. So, and I think people need to be a little bit careful by saying, oh yeah, that's 4 miles away, that's 3 miles away. It's very easy. I'm sure if I went and Googled right now, I could probably confirm that the golf club isn't however many miles away that it's just been mentioned. I'm not being rude or nothing, but we've got to be fair on this situation, fair for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Aspinall.
Mr. Barclay, I think that far from trying to put Mary Cook off her stride, I was not intending to wave anything at her, but I'm glad she's raised this question about delegated authority, because it was one of the points that I made on my note when I read through the document that you put out. I would add in that, in my view, that to take this out does need not delegated authority in the way that Mr. Fullstone is operating, but it needs a full council decision. Not only that, but I'd like to ask whether the decision about the 5 villages for growth has been a decision of the full council, or whether it's a whim of the officers to try and fudge their numbers at some particular time. The whole question of the discussion on the local plan seems to vibrate around any way that we can get this through at an early opportunity and persuade you to deal with this. One thing that I was going to raise also on this subject, and I'm sorry to do this to you, Mr. Barclay, but I am deeply concerned about the fact that at the last sessions we talked about a 3-year review, but there's been no, as I understand it, no discussion within the council, full council, to do that. And you didn't get any decision out of the officers as to exactly what they meant by a 3-year review. Was it a review, rubber stamp, we're doing okay, let's get on with it, which is what seems to be happening here. And that needs to be addressed, sir, because if there is no full council decision to do that, and all these other things that are coming up, then in my view, we're running into a potential challenge somewhere along the way. Final point, and please, Mr. Smith, don't forget my 4 points earlier on. My final point is that, remember, 140 houses in Barkway will produce about £2.15 million in Section 106 money, of which a quarter of that, if there's a neighbourhood development plan, will go back to the village, £500,000, to improve all the amenities that are so desperately, it would appear, needed in Barkway. So we're not talking about just a ideological aspect, we're talking about a really big financial aspect of the future of Barkway. And the parish council and all the representatives need to understand that with 140 houses, and there could be more, if I got my way, you know, Mr. Barclay, I raised right at the beginning of the sessions way back in 2018 that land adjoining the villages should be or could be applicable to building consideration in the same way that it was for the towns. But the district council took that wording out of the towns, and flexibility is not the word that seems to be in the understanding of the North Herts District Council. We seem to be restrain, restrict, do anything we can to stop building. And now whether it's fear of the electorate and councillors concerned that they may now got elected, but it should also be fear that if they don't perform because they've been underperforming, we'll get to the situation where the whole subject will be taken over by an inspector and it will fall outside of the district council authority. And in the next couple of years anyway, we'll have a unitary council. So the delegated authority issue that Mary Cook raises is very important. We seem to be in never, never land. Finished.
Thank you, Mr. Aspinall. Ms. Ormsby, you have your hand up and you're next on my list. Did you want to come in at this point?
Yes, I mean, it was just to address you in relation to the delegation, if you'd like to hear the council on that.
Sure.
Yeah. Insofar as the status of the proposed main modification that is before you from the council is concerned, so that is not a change to the plan. It is literally a suggested change to the plan and has the same status that all the other main modifications that have been suggested to you by the council have. The only person now who can make any change to the plan is you, sir, through a recommendation which the council then have to consider and either accept if they want to formally adopt the plan. And therefore the status of the proposed main modification is simply that. And so you referred to the Flaxby case. If you look at paragraph 68, subparagraph 4 of the Flaxby case on page 15, the suggested or proposed main modification falls within the category identified in that subparagraph, which is a category that properly falls within delegated authority. So clearly there is a power under the legislation to make those suggestions to you through delegated authority. And we say that we have complied with the delegation that is in existence, in that Mr. Fulston has made the decision that it's appropriate to put that proposal before you for consideration. So we don't accept that the council have acted unlawfully in relation to the proposed main modification that it's put before you, in the same way that it's put a whole host of other main modifications in front of you. So unless I can help you further on that, that's the point I just wanted to make.
No, thank you for that.
Thanks.
Mr. Hawkins.
Thank you, Inspector. I just would like to come back to the point that was made by Councillor Morris earlier with regard to building anywhere else within North Herts District Council's area. Yes, clearly none of us want to see developments that are unsound, unsustainable in any area across the district. And in fact, for the last 6 or 7 years, we have set out to try and achieve an intelligent conversation on that basis. I would just remind Councillor Morris that the District Council is using the need for homes as their exceptional circumstances to override the protection afforded to the Greenbelt. And specifically talking about growth villages, as I've said, Barkway is one of 5 and the 4 other are all in the Greenbelt. And so the point I'm trying to make in relation to ensuring that the local plan is still an accepted local plan and still lawful is that if you're to remove non-Greenbelt developments and you're arguing that you need to use Greenbelt to develop in, man speak with forked tongue when it comes to trying to get that point across. I know that the local plan has been through several years of political change. I know several years ago the intention, and quite honourably, the local authority have tried to build more and more homes to support the need. But the need has very, very simply changed, as is represented by the ONS, the Office of National Statistics. And I know that this inspector has already stated he is minded to consider the OAN. He is also minded to consider the buffer, which in respect would likely reduce the total number of homes within this particular plan. It might also remove a number of the major objections, which some of my colleagues on this Zoom connection today will have journeyed with me in terms of trying to convey to North Herts District Council. Let it be said that we want to see a plan, but we do not want to see a plan that falls foul of stepping into areas that will cause that plan to go to some form of statutory review in the future. So yes, I feel for the people of Barkway in all sorts of ways, but you haven't got the protection of Greenbelt. You haven't had it for 50, 60 years like the rest of the Greenbelt spaces within Hertfordshire. And if that protection is to count for anything, it has to be dealt with in a way of considering it alongside places where homes can be built and which are not protected. And that's the point I would like to make. Thank you, Inspector.
Thank you, Mr. Hawkins. Ms. Cottier.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to go back to the delegated authority matter, because I'm in the middle of trying to get from North Herts District Council and the minutes for the part of the meeting where the full council last met to speak about, their concerns about maybe the figures of the plan were too high, and if that could be reduced, then there would be more flexibility over, perhaps not having such large sites, and well, there could be some reductions made, and they weren't going to discuss where exactly they would be, but of course sites such as Barkway or any other site that the locals didn't really want that degree of development, that would give them more leeway, so it affects that. And that was when the delegated authority was last used, and there was a meeting held on the 8th of October for this, and they discussed it at full council, but halfway through the meeting it was taken offline, which I am not sure how that fits definition of examination in public if you've taken away to have a private discussion outside of the public view. However, it happened, and they came back, and then they partially disclosed what was said during that secret part of the meeting and claimed that it wasn't secret at all, and then sort of a few councillors indicated what had been said to them, and you had to read between the lines, but there was a partial disclosure, and that's an important point, because now I have written to the council to ask them for an audio recording of what was said, and also minutes of it, and they've written back to me to confirm there is no audio recording of what was said, but there are some minutes, but they can't be released to me because of they're saying a section 42 special legal privilege, which I looked into, and it appears that in order to claim a special legal privilege you have to apply a public interest test. And I'm in the process of composing a letter back to the council to argue that it's in the public interest on the points that they give as the criteria for this to be released. However, I did have confirmed to me the person's name who gave the special legal advice, and that was Ms. Ormsby gave the special legal advice. But what I'm concerned about is what we do know about what happened inside of that meeting was that there was great pressure applied to the councillors not to make this change, not to vote for this change that they were suggesting. And we're not clear exactly what was said, but it appears that there was some type of suggestion that if you were to lower the figures more in line with these new projections, then there would be likelihood that the developers would start lodging court cases against the council. But this to me seems to be spurious advice, because if we're having a discussion about bringing figures back in line with reality to give more flexibility and more bespoke options on sites, perhaps such as Barkway, as we speak about this today, and then later on today we'll be speaking about its wider implications, surely we would need to look at what happened when this meeting occurred and there was an attempt to make an alteration by the delegated authority, and it went horribly wrong. And I'm still now trying to get to the bottom of it, because we don't really feel that this was an examination in public. And I'm not really clear whether it was because of the council were discussing it, therefore we, as part of this examination hearing process, this is okay for it to be in private, but I was of the understanding that this public examination should be happening as it says in public. So bit of a bad thing there.
Yeah, just one thing that I want to make absolutely clear, and that is that the special meeting that was held by the council was no part of my examination of the local plan. That's a separate process, which is about, which frankly just about the council and how the council works internally. So that isn't something that I can comment on either, because that's not a matter for me. It's like I say, it's not any part of my examination at all.
Yeah, okay. I thought that would be the case, but it does bring into question what happens and how this examination is going to interface with any suggested changes or changes that councillors may want to make, and also transparency and trust in the council as a whole, between us who participated in this examination and then how they're responding to us. And at the moment, it seems that in spite of lots of people having put forward their suggestions, there really hasn't been any compromise ever made in any area at all, as I'm yet to see it. So yes, and now we have this secret thing, which you say is not part of your remit, but yeah, it's not created a good impression at all, and I don't think it really leads to us having much trust in any type of review idea, because if the councillors are not participating anyway during this hearing, then they won't be up to speed. They'll be arriving too late to the party to understand what's been said. They need to have been here from the beginning, fighting or agreeing or whatever they want to say, but at least participating in some way. And it's fallen on the shoulders of people like me, other people in these meetings that have attended regularly to do this, and yet we're not the councillors, and it shouldn't be falling on us. But if we weren't here, then nobody would be here. So this is a whole this is a shabby state of affairs, frankly. And I'm when the local elections come up, then I think it's really important for people to maybe think about who they're going to be putting in, because we want somebody who was going to work hard for us, not going to leave us to do all the work, and then they just disappear into their little mouse holes, well, after being bullied into saying what they want what the council wants them to say, or certain people in the council want to say.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Morris.
Thank you, sir. So just to clarify, I don't know whether Mr. Hawkins was suggesting that I speak with forked tongue or the council. Just to repeat, I don't support building on Greenbelt generally, and he could possibly look at my voting record recently if that was what he was suggesting. Also, Mr. Fletcher mentioned the Bridleway Green route that actually does run through BK3 all the way to Barley, which is true. Suggest he tries walking it at the moment. Take rather a long time, I would suggest. Thank you.
Can I just answer that, Inspector? No, Councillor Morris, I did not mean to offend you. I was talking about the collective when I was talking about man. So my apologies if it was misunderstood.
Ms. Hamilton.
I'm thinking I've got a little note in a bit that I was going to raise 230.4c, and it says this, and I'm wondering whether this is what Miss Cottier was getting at. By what came back from that thing that you're obviously not allowed to sort of touch on, a number of the councillors did say that the council are very concerned that developers will take legal action and there will be legal costs. So I think what maybe Ms. Cottier was trying to raise was, why are the council so bothered about if some of the sites were removed from the plan, okay, why are they bothered that they might be ending up with incurring legal costs from those sites, but they seem to be bothered about incurring legal costs if BK3 was to raise like a bit of a legal situation. I think maybe that's what Miss Potier might have been going with, because that did make me think, well, hang on, how can they be okay if these ones do it but not this one? So it did raise that in my notes that I'd already made. So I don't know if that's correct.
Ms. Cotier.
Yeah, that's reminded me of something I did want to say. I looked at this and I thought to myself, it makes no sense whatsoever why Barkway would be given such special treatment. All these other sites would be thrown to the wolves. But then I began to think, hey, maybe there's a reason why this is happening. Perhaps they're doing it in order to make the inspector say this isn't fair, therefore it would have wider implications in the local plan, as you've asked in your question, which we'll go on to this afternoon probably, and would render it in some way unsound and put the inspector in the position of having to be the one to suggest some radical alteration, or not if he chooses. But there's a chance that in that case, if it was explicitly unfair, then he may have to. And that would then remove the responsibility and likelihood of these so-called perceived court cases. Whether or not that's the case or not, I debate that, but it might be, or that's how they view it at the very least. And that would then mean that takes the responsibility away from them, and they wouldn't then be the ones to be held responsible. And they'll say, well, if the inspector has told us to do it, so we have to. So it might be them actually doing something in order to create that situation. That's what I think Nikki she just reminded me of that. I just wanted to say that it just makes no sense. I know there's been a school reason given, but when we look at the problems in the other areas, it doesn't really tally. So I'm sort of trying to get behind their behaviour here and figure out what's really going on. Has somebody in connection, well, during this local plan, during the neighbourhood plan making process, has somebody come, do they know somebody? Has somebody said something to the council and sort of said, well, you know, can you do something? And they've said, yeah, okay, we'll try our best. And they've looked for a reason, and this is what they've come up with. Whereas if they were looking at the other sites with equal scrutiny, they would see many other problems too relating to that. And they would have more flexibility ultimately if they had taken the opportunity to reduce the numbers and not applied pressure on the councillors to, well, actually they only won in favour of that for about 4 people, I think. So I mean, really there was serious doubt, but then they would have had more flexibility to make these types of bespoke adjustments. And Mr. Aspinall has been talking about spreading development more widely across villages for a long time, and that mirrors, whilst we come at it from different angles, we overlap in that regard, because it would spread the development out more widely, and why concentrate it only in certain places? And we do have time to make these adjustments, but where can we go from here if we keep trying to make our suggestions to the council in order to make the plan, put the plan in a more sound state? And we've all agreed we actually do want a plan in place, because it would be highly dangerous not to have one. Then we've got to work together. But when I am sending letters to the council, for example, we sent some information to Nigel Smith before Christmas, I haven't even had an answer. This was some very, very high quality documents that we produced over a period of about 3 weeks. And I sent them to him before Christmas, and then I sent a follow-up reminder on the 7th of January, and I haven't even received any acknowledgement. How can we communicate with these people when they're stonewalling us in this way? We would never be able to give any input because it's never received. So, I mean, we're not going to ever reach a solution if that's the attitude.
Thank you. Mr. Hawkins.
Thank you, Inspector. Just taking up some of the points that Caroline has just mentioned. Yes, we support Mr. Aspinall and his desire to build on the edge of villages. In fact, the Wymondley neighbourhood plan suggests building of up to 50 homes with the village would be within the village boundary would be an acceptable option. I think it's when obviously numbers become so large that local people become quite touchy about what's going on in their backyard. And, you know, as a consequence, you know, we start having to discuss and negotiate around sort of various moving targets, it feels like at times, having sat through these examinations in public over the years. So, you know, at this point in time, I know that the numbers is the real issue as to how many houses you, Mr. Inspector, are in giving authority to be produced or to be developed within Hertfordshire. I also know that you're considering the buffer as well. And, you know, the long and the short of it is that I've sat and read the paper that the authority has put in with regard to releasing the growth villages. And here we are negotiating which growth villages that we're supposed to release because we might not be able to reach the 5-year housing land supply requirements. You know, at some stage, Inspector, there's a decision to be made about the total number, and that will equate to the removal of sites. And, you know, this whole conversation here about Barkway could be removed at the stroke of a pen if, for example, you were to decide that growth villages were to be removed in their entirety. The only reason that we sit there and suggest that, you know, the greenbelt sites are the most important is because clearly we want to release the greenbelt sites from the plan. We'd like to release as a priority, the ones in the growth villages. We'd certainly like to see east of Luton being released, and we'd certainly like to see GA2 being taken out of the plan. I think once we remove all of those issues, we have less problems with the local plan, and the local plan can come before the developers and be developed. But as it stands right now, we seem to be arguing about numbers, and then we're arguing about where we build them. But I think generally we are vexed by some of the ideas within the local plan, not all of it, but some of the ideas which I know, Inspector, you will take due consideration of, having heard us all over the last 3 years chundering on about what's happening in North Hertfordshire. So no pressure, but I know that you're very capable of taking it. And you know, unfortunately, the whole of the council now has resolved to leaving the final decision with you, which doesn't sound terribly democratic, but it is a fact of life. And, you know, we can only rely upon your good services, Inspector, to come up with the right solution. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that, I think, Mr. Hawkins. Ms. Norgan.
I just wanted to agree with Ms. Cottier when she's telling you that when emails are sent to Nigel Smith, they're just not answered by, certainly by myself. And if Ms. Cottier is saying that she doesn't get any replies, I am totally frustrated with the planners of North Hertfordshire District Council. If I were to go through emails that I've written to Nigel Smith, these go right back to early October 2019, again about density, and you can make various suggestions to Nigel Smith. CPRE have made various suggestions. There have been meetings with Nigel Smith, with CPRE representatives from London on density issues. They take no notice of creative ideas. They take no notice of what we say. They don't answer emails. I think this is going to come in tomorrow's sessions, but it is impossible to actually make any progress with any of the planning officials at NHDC. And there, certainly in a local plan, there should be a method of I'm looking for the right word, but listening to what the public and parish councillors and parish councils are saying when they are objecting to 900 houses stuck on the end of Gravely, for instance, at NS1. They just don't interact, and that is the frustrating issue, and one of the problems in this whole local plan, that whatever is said, whether it's polite or whatever, we do feel totally ignored. And one of the reasons that I write to my MP, Bir Mafalami, who is fairly supportive and talks about the importance of green belt, is because we get nowhere with the councillors and we get nowhere with the planners. And that is entirely wrong. It's not a way to get a good local plan developed. And that, to be honest, is why people like Carolyn and Nikki and myself continue to come to this public local plan and get these points across 2 years as the planning inspector. It's total frustration with the way North Herts District Council conducts its planning.
Thank you for that, Ms Norgan. Right, so I'm going to hear now from Councillor Dennis. Then I'm going to come back to the council for it to pick up on some of the points that we've heard. I've got 1 or 2 questions, then I want to make progress. I'm notionally, I should say, on the first issue, which is issue 30.1 on my matters and issues, and I want to move on to talking about the spatial strategy and Barkway's place within it, which frankly quite a number of people have touched on quite heavily, if I can put it that way, already in any event. So first of all then, Councillor Dennis.
Thank you, sir. If I could just raise 1 or 2 points following on comments made by various people. The first one is a usual myth that a parish council will always refuse every planning application. I'd just like to point out that since 2010, we have given working closely with North Herts to get a proper and effective policy through. We've built 43 new homes, and we have currently under planning consideration a further 28. My point being that, you know, our heads are not in the sand. We are trying to be fair, trying to be progressive, but trying to work within what I call the village identity. And I'd just like to make another comment. Mr. Aspinall mentioned about section 106. Yes, we're fully aware of that. But in his submissions about building, he makes no mentions of infrastructure requirements. And I would point out that was in another hearing on the 9th of October 2018. I can give you the reference, sir. What the inspector there made specific comments on the infrastructure requirements within that particular application, which was subsequently refused. I've heard nothing today from I've heard nothing to do with that. Whether it is part and parcel of it, I don't know, but I think it is important. I'm dealing currently with a constituent's comment and complaint that last year the storm sewer overspilled 17 times for a total of 175 hours. My concern, and I'm working with our MP, Sir Oliver Heal, to get a submission from Thames Water to the effect of the capacity of our sewage plant at the moment, because our concerns are, should it overflow, then it overflows. We're not going to get a super sewer such as London's getting, but these sorts of requirements have to be considered. And I think it is important to make that point. that obviously I'm still going to keep at Thames Water to get more clarification on that subject. Another, I think, gentleman mentioned about the bridleway. There's subsequently, at the moment, an application, I think, from Newsource to have the footpath extended around their site, which would make it a lot longer and a bigger distance to get, should a person wish to walk from Barkway to Barley. It has been said often in the past and at that previous hearing, oh, yes, it is a footpath, yes, it is a bridleway, but it is totally impractical should a mother and toddler wish to use it to get to the shops or to the school. Subsequently, they would have to use the road. The road is dangerous. There is no footpath. I wouldn't recommend anyone either to walk it. I've walked it myself, so I do know. The traffic is excessive. We're currently working, which might nothing to do with it, to try and get some help from the county on speed control. It's totally impractical. And I just wanted to mention those points. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Councillor Dennis. Mr. Smith, then, yeah, if you'd like to pick up on the points that we've heard this morning, there are a good number of them. Yeah, I think, as I said, in particular, the point about it not being very far between Barkway and Barley, and that a shuttle bus service is provided or could be provided for the school.
Yep, certainly. I'll pick up those points first. Firstly, to say that the shuttle bus is no longer operational. That was there for a time, but now isn't, and children are transported by car between the two sites, which, if needs be, I'm sure Mr. Prayati can confirm that from the Education Authority's point of view, if you'd just like to hear that.
Please.
Yeah, from correspondence which our education officers have had with the school, we can confirm that that is our understanding of the current position.
And with regards to potentially making that good, as you've alluded to, obviously that is a matter that could be looked at through any applications in this area in terms of potentially looking at 106 contributions. But as you'll be aware, sir, the reality of commuted sums like of that nature are normally there for a fixed term period, say 10 years. And what we need here is a solution in perpetuity. You know, you might get a short term solution, but what happens when that funding or when that money runs out? In terms of the distance, I don't dispute the distance of 2 to 2.5 miles quoted, depending on precisely where you take your measurements from. But as mentioned by firstly Councillor Morris and Councillor Dennis just now, it's not really a viable walking or cycling journey, you know, for adults, let alone young children. As just been mentioned, it's a de-restricted country road. The footpath where it's there is narrow, and in places it's not there at all. You say there's a number of other points been made. I guess the important question, what this all comes back down to, is what are the circumstances in front of you now as you're being asked to consider this position or make your decision on this site? And just to recap on those, really, it's not at issue between any of the parties. It seems to me that there's only provision for nursery reception and year one within the village of Barkway itself. As outlined by Mr. Prayati in the first morning session, it's anticipated that if BK3 was developed, then in any given year, 17 of the children would be educated in the same village as the allocated site, with a majority, 25, travelling to Barkway. And obviously that compares to 42 children if there was a full first school offer, as there was at the point the site was initially considered, and as there would be in other locations in this area under the 3-tier system.
If I could just clarify those figures, Mr. Smith, are these totals or are these additional? These are the additional children arising from the development. Yeah, so 17 additional children. Yeah. Yeah, I thought so.
Yes. And again, as we've set out, I mean, obviously, Ms Cook and Mr Fletcher on behalf of the site promoters have made the case that they think their development will ensure the sustainability of that arrangement. I don't think we necessarily dispute that some development can be considered appropriate. Indeed, obviously we're saying that BK2 should remain in the plan. BK1's now been developed, and those will help the long-term operational sustainability of the school. But it's a question of scale. Clearly, BK1, which has been built, is 13 homes, so it's less than 10% of the size of BK3. BK2 is in the plan for 20 homes, so it's a seventh of the size. The federation arrangement that's there, it's commendable, isn't it? It's a commendable way of dealing with the population, or the needs of the population that arises from the current situation. They found a way to balance the two schools and provide a solution for the villages. But I think the question for the plan is it sensible and sustainable for the plan, looking at future development, to plan for large scale development that sort of compounds those issues and relies on the same patterns of travel between the villages. I think if we were starting from a blank sheet of paper and knew what we knew now when we were allocating the site, I think it's questionable as to whether it would have been in the plan submitted to you in the first place. And I think it's wholly reasonable that you take that change of circumstances into account. Barkway is one of the smaller villages in the district. You can see that set out in the table we've put in our statement looking at the education arrangements. It's got a more limited range of facilities than some of the other villages, but at the time we submitted the plan, and picking up on Mr Hawkins' point, really, we balanced that against the need to take opportunities in the area beyond the Greenbelt to reduce pressure upon and support the Case 4 sites that are in the Greenbelt, and therefore BK3 made it over the threshold, whereas we'd now say that the balance is in the opposite direction now. It's tipped the other way. We've set out to you our case that many of the Greenbelt locations on their own merits are more sustainable locations for development. And again, we've reiterated that in our statement for this session, having laid that out to you at the previous sessions before Christmas. Ultimately, the rural area at the east of the district, you're right, it's not Greenbelt, but part of the reason it isn't Greenbelt is because of the considerable distance, relatively speaking, between the larger settlements. It doesn't meet the tests to be defined as Greenbelt, but that also means the settlement pattern here is inherently less sustainable than in other parts of the district. As I say, our view is that the balance is tipped on this site. That's the position we're putting to you, but we recognise absolutely this is your decision to make, and in that you need to consider the harms and benefits of BK3, both in itself in relation to sustainability and scale of development proposed, and also in relation to the strategic position, again alluded to by Mr Hawkins and others. So you need to look at the relative merits of the settlements where development is being proposed, housing need, housing supply, and the balancing of Greenbelt versus non-Greenbelt sites, and whether you think we've exhausted sites in the rural area to the necessary degree to support the release of Greenbelt sites. And we say that you can completely rationally reach a decision to take BK3 out of the plan on its own merits without upsetting those wider arguments. But as I say, ultimately that's your decision to make. So if it's a decision that is made, it's something that we consulted on through main modifications. Were there any other specific points you wanted to hear back from the council on?
Mr. Barclay, have you got my photo on your screen? I seem to have got lost.
I can see you, Mr. Aspinall.
That's all right then.
I have a question which I think will be for the county council, Mr. Proetti. That was a terrible attempt at pronouncing your surname. I do apologise. Yeah, so, well, in short, in your view, is there a reasonable likelihood of the land being the land identified for primary education being needed during this plan period? What is the county's stance on that?
Thank you, sir, and no worries on the pronunciation. I've heard much worse in my time. On the question, based on the information to date, so the current information, we can confirm that the level of growth proposed in Barkway can be accommodated through the Barley and Barkway first schools. So in that case, at the moment, there isn't a need for that reserve school site to come forward to provide education provision. However, as we have said in our hearing statement and our reps, we do feel that it is useful for it to be retained in order to provide some amount of long-term option in case there's any changes or fluctuations in the yield. But at the moment, yes, it wouldn't be needed in the short term.
When you say the short term, is that the plan period?
It's difficult to say. The short term being the sort of the early years, I guess. When we're talking about the later years, that's obviously a considerable amount of time. Yields may have changed by that point, which might trigger some kind of need. The longer you go, the more difficult it's to say with any degree of certainty. So kind of all we can say at the moment is that at the moment, based on current information, it wouldn't be required based on the level of growth coming forward in Barkway.
So is that to say then that on current evidence, there isn't a reasonable likelihood that the land would be needed?
Yes, on balance, that would probably be the correct statement, yes.
Okay, I'm just going to tell you what I've written because I don't want to misrepresent your view. I've put that, I've set myself up to say your surname again now, that Mr. Proetti, my apologies, said that on current evidence, there isn't a reasonable likelihood that the land will be needed in the plan period.
Yes, I would say if you want some definitive statement, that would be it. As I sort of go back to my previous reps and statement, the County Council believes that in prudent planning for education, it would be useful that it is there in case something occurs. But you're right with that statement. On balance, it's unlikely to be needed based on current information. Yes.
Okay, thank you for that. And Mr. Smith, just so there's no uncertainty in my mind, yeah, what I want to know is where the council stands, depending on what I conclude in relation to BK3, i.e. BK3, the housing site. If I think that the site should stay in the plan, then what does the council say should happen in relation to the reserve school land? And also, the same question if I reach a different conclusion about BK3.
If you were minded to say it should stay in, then I guess we'd be in a position where we'd suggest we go largely or sort of towards the position we had in the main modifications, where there is some form of allocation on the land. Because obviously that was your concern the first time around. It was left as white land and could in theory be brought forward for development the day after we adopt. whether that is within the allocation, a reserve school site, or perhaps seems more likely now it might be some form of safeguarded site, in that Mr. Priority's confirmed there's no reasonable prospect of it being brought forward in the plan period, but clearly in plan making terms it needs to be acknowledged in some form of way, because if BK3 was there, then the village boundary would rightfully be drawn around the outside of BK3, and you don't want white land of that scale in a village of this size, and that was your specific concern the first time around. So some form of perhaps safeguarding allocation to prevent any other use other than education, should there be a proven need. But clearly there'd need to be some sort of regime on there in terms of the ongoing management of it, because as we said before in relation to the applications, and appreciating this is more a development management design issue, there have been some significant concerns raised about the relationship of the remainder of that site to the village. So we'd need to consider how we secured that. If you were minded to take it out, I guess it becomes 6 1 half does the other as to whether you need to safeguard it, or whether you need to whether putting it outside the settlement boundary in the rural area gives you the right protection, or whether you put it outside the boundary and safeguard it. I mean, any of those solutions kind of provide you the same protection in that it avoids a kind of unanticipated windfall coming forward. So for ease, we probably just say safeguard, some form of safeguarded designation on the school site either way, because then we know where we stand, and whether it's in or within or without the village boundary, therefore perhaps becomes slightly a moot point, doesn't it?
Right, okay. So in terms of the questions that I have on issue 30.1 and 30.2, I think we've covered all that. I can see there are a number of hands up. I'll take brief points, but I am wanting to move to issue 30.3 and Barkway's place in the settlement hierarchy. But very briefly then, Mr. Hawkins.
Thank you, Inspector. I just wanted to qualify whether Mr. Proietti and whether Mr. Smith were suggesting that the bus service between the two schools had been removed this year. When exactly did they have in mind? Because obviously a whole number of bus services have been removed due to COVID. So are we actually suggesting that it's a COVID reason for removal of the bus service between the two schools? Could one of them answer that, please?
That's a good point, and I hadn't thought about it. I assumed not, but I don't know, Mr. Smith?
My understanding is no, it's not a COVID related. But again, Mr. Proietti can perhaps confirm that or provide the detail.
Do you have the date of the removal?
Well, if we hear from Mr. Proietti.
Yep. So it wasn't, I believe, a COVID reason. What I got in our correspondence with the school was that the minibus broke, it went to be fixed. There's a hire vehicle for a while. Then it was decided that I think in September of this year, so for the new school year, that due to the Federation happening, they'd not restart the service. The service that is used free to parents, and as such, it wasn't cost effective for the school.
Okay, but I'm sure COVID would have played a part in that decision as well, because obviously having young people travel to school in their parents' cars is going to keep a degree of social distancing happening. it does appear that the Hertfordshire County Council are just not keen on enhancing the provision, which seems to me to be really the case in all of this. I did quite make the point earlier that Stevenage is 4.4 miles from Wymondley and Royston is 4.5 miles from Barkway. And, you know, when I was a child growing up in Stevenage, I actually walked 2 miles every day to school. Now, I fully understand if it's unsafe for that journey to be undertaken on foot, then surely it's incumbent upon the local authority to provide services that enable education to happen in some shape or form. As a consequence of that, I'm still really finding it very difficult to understand why the schooling issue is the central issue for wanting to remove a non-greenbelt site with the potential to build 240 homes from the local plan. And given the statements made in the paper submitted to the inspector with regard to the 5-year housing land supply, it does appear to me that this is a little bit double speak when it comes to need and desire for developments. So as a consequence, I would suggest that in this set of circumstances, unless of course the inspector is minded to remove all growth villages, which would be you know, his decision alone, then as it stands, I am concerned about the way this impacts the viability of the local plan going forward, should it need to be reviewed. So that's the point I wanted to make. Thank you, Inspector.
Okay, I'm not going to come back to you on this issue, Mr. Hawkins. So if there's anything, right, okay, thank you, Ms. Cottier, and the same point to you as well. This is last chance on this issue.
Yes, I heard Nigel's previous answers, but I didn't hear his reply to the point that I made. He addressed the points that most of the other people made, but I wanted to know, will I be getting a response to the information I sent him about the 3 documents that I sent him twice? He didn't respond on that point.
No, I didn't. Obviously, it's not a matter for the examination per se, but I'll go back through emails and see what outstanding correspondence I have, and if there's an acknowledgement to be sent, I will send it.
Mr. Aspinall.
Well, you could guess this was going to come. I asked 4 questions, and Mr. Smith has a pretty good habit of, when he doesn't want to answer something, he just ignores it. He's been ignoring me for 3 years about Hella. He cannot bring himself to even mention it in his statements. Can't even mention it. So I'll repeat the questions that I asked regarding school. And if he can't answer, he simply has to say, I don't know the answer. I asked, are all the children that go to Barkway and the other school at Barley all Indigenous children? In other words, are they children that live within the village? I asked whether the Hertfordshire County Council at any time tend to merge the schools for good business or education practice, because clearly that's an important aspect for all the residents of those 2 villages. And it's a question of funding and everything. I think from the debate, I've got the message that BK2 and BK3 are not currently in the settlement boundary at the present time, under the whatever plan they're working to. And I think I've got the answer that the land that we're talking about and the land around Barkway, when we refer to not protected, it is because it's land beyond the green belt, not green belt. Now that's very important. If he can't answer them, he must just say, I can't answer them, I don't know the answer.
Mr. Smith?
Certainly, obviously.
So rather than Mr. Smith answer now, why don't we just hear what everybody's got to say and then him answer right at the end?
Yeah, okay, all right, that's not a bad idea. So yeah, I've got Ms. Cook and Mr. Fletcher. I'll hear from them and then I will hear from Mr. Smith. So Ms. Cook, first of all.
Thank you very much, sir. I just wanted to come back in relation to what Mr. Smith said to you. He suggested that that they had decided that in relation to the question of scale, that BK2 alone would provide an adequate level of pupils, as it were, to sustain the schools. You've actually got absolutely no evidence of that, no evidence whatsoever. It's also perfectly clear that the council, neither North Herts nor indeed the county council, have actually explored the opportunities for transportation between Berkeley and Barley. They seem to have instead of having a can-do attitude, they seem quite determined to just close BK3 down. At least that's how it seems from our point of view. Because what is undoubtedly the case is that we now have Barkway and Barley operating as one school with unmet capacity. And we have a bus service that operates between those two. We have a bridleway. There seems to be no possibility or countenance on behalf of either of those authorities on getting the developer to improve the bridleway so as to make that suitable. I see absolutely no reason why that couldn't happen. I see no reason why the authorities haven't investigated the possibility of a new bus being provided by the developer of BK3. And there already are children being bused to the secondary schools in Royston. They go via Barley. What's the matter with North Herts and the county council? It's just ridiculous to suppose that 140 dwellings couldn't open up these possibilities, which would assist everyone. I feel that there's something going on here. It seems so unreal. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Fletcher.
So just to say very briefly, because I think Ms. Cook's already covered it, really just to make the point that there is a bus service that runs in the morning and in the afternoon from bus stop on Cambridge Road, which is just outside of the BK3 allocation, that has the capability of busing children from Barley and then back again at the end of the school day. I think the point that Mr. Hawkins made about the bus service during obviously the COVID pandemic is also a valid point. Thank you.
Ms. Norgan.
I'm going back to Mr. Aspinall's point, and we have raised this before, but it's not clear to me. Why did North Herts District Council never do a HALA, or however we pronounce this? Because I'm looking at a letter I've got from the Department for Communities and Local Government that's dated 23rd of December 2014, which is referring me not only to NPPF and the importance of green belt in the government's opinion, but it refers to housing and economic land availability assessment, and then it refers to planning practice guidance. It then sends me to a URL which talks about effective use of land, including planning for higher density development. And I've already said that the council has not proved its acute need because it's not building, or its developers are not building at high enough density. So my big question to Nigel Smith is what has happened to that housing and economic land availability assessment, which ought to have been in the local plan when it was first produced? And that's Mr. Aspinall's comment, and Carolyn Cottier has also mentioned that we've never had an answer from Mr. Smith. So perhaps, Inspector, you could clarify that with him.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's not something that's on today's agenda, and it has been picked up several times before. But Ms. Hamilton.
I don't generally back developers. This is quite an strange sort of situation, to be honest with you. But I do know that we do need development. But I am puzzled by all this situation. I'm very puzzled by this lateness into this plan regarding BK3. I mean, I'm thinking of all the other sites in the plan, and I'm looking at the map, and I'm looking at the proposal, sir, and like, even with the reserved school site in it, there's still part of BK3 that would overlap some of the residences in Barkway anyway. So it wouldn't be totally isolated, even with the white land in the middle. And it would be far more a conclusive development than, say, GA2, which is totally separated by a ruddy great big woodland. So I still can't quite understand NHDC's logical thinking or reasoning why this one would be removed. Yeah, I'm puzzled. I'm wondering whether there is something else underlying in the situation, and I still would be interested to know why Newsels think it would have such a negative impact on the stud farm as well. I'm just confused by that. It just doesn't, something seems to be missing here. The puzzle doesn't seem to fit. Thank you.
Well, I've heard from Musels on that previously, so I'm not going to ask them to go back through that. What I am going to do now then is hear from Ms. Ormsby and from Mr. Smith. Then I'm going to take a break and then move on the agenda for today onto issue 30.3. So Ms. Ormsby, first of all.
So yes, it was just this point which Mr. Smith may want to pick up on. In relation to this bus service provision, it seems that, as I understand it, the developer is potentially offering that, and whether or not that should, if BK3 were to stay in, become a criteria to BK3, that funding for a bus service should be provided in perpetuity in relation to the bringing forward of that site, if you were minded to support the retention of BK3. But I'll just let Mr. Smith pick up on that when he addresses you, sir.
Yes, just remind me that that's not a criteria at present, is it?
No, sir.
No.
Yeah, I thought not. I will just ask, I don't know whether it should be Mr. Fletcher or whether it's Miss Cook.
Take it.
Comment on that. If I were to have something along those lines in my mind as a potential main modification.
Yeah, I think on principle, I mean, I certainly don't. I want to keep this separate from any development management process, but there certainly have been a meeting with the development management team where there were discussions around provision for funding of a bus service between Barkway and Barley. So I think that, in principle, that's something we would be supportive of. Certainly have no objection to.
Yeah. I suppose well, to be explicit, what I'm asking is that if I shared some of the council's concerns in relation to car journeys, but nonetheless concluded that the site should stay in, would it be necessary for soundness to include a criteria like that within the policy?
Sir, can I just chip in and say it would be perfectly satisfactory for you to reach a planning judgment that there should be improved service provision working on the basis, as we have been told today, although it's not in any written evidence, that there's currently no school service between the two, you could imagine quite sensibly a developer would want to explore whether the answer to the issue is a minibus, or whether the answer to the issue is doing more in terms of improving the bus service that goes from Barkway to Barley to Royston. That there are slightly different considerations there. It depends on whether the focus, which your focus is on the school point, which of course is the only thing that's driven the county, only thing that's driven North Herts to take this position. So logically, it would seem to me that you ought to be more interested in the provision of a minibus. And as I mentioned before, sir, this is exactly the sort of thing that the neighbourhood plan was promoting, or is promoting in their current version.
Okay, thank you. And finally then from Mr. Smith.
Yes, just to pick up on the point that was just being discussed, obviously, if you were minded to keep it in, then yeah, I think it would need a criterion of that ilk to be effective, wouldn't it? Because clearly this is an area of concern. I think you just need to be mindful of whatever that criterion requires is appropriate in terms of the service. And I think Ms. Cook just picked up on it, in fairness, around more being a minibus rather than a bus route, because obviously these are small children we're transporting between school sites. It needs to be a dedicated transport. And the point I made earlier and picked up by Miss Ormsby when she suggested it should be in perpetuity, that obviously it needs to be something that lasts. We can't have a sort of a funding agreement with 5 years, 10 years of commuted summers. These things normally are. You get a maintenance fee that you gradually eat through, and then when that expires, the service disappears. On that point,
it's a capital cost issue, isn't it? So that's the capital cost of a minibus,
and a revenue cost to keep it running.
Indeed, but we must remember that more pupils equals more funding. With more pupils in these schools, the county will get more funding from government.
Okay. Okay, thank you for that. On other points, Mr. Smith, then.
Yeah, just to pick up on the point Ms. Cook made about BK2, I think it was a slight mischaracterization. She's right, there's no sort of specific numerical evidence around the numbers we're promoting. Yeah, I think it's unfair to say that I said BK2 would in itself make the school sustainable. I made a general point at the outset that we are not putting a moratorium on development in either Barkway or Bartley, that even if you take BK3 out, there are anticipated in the region of 80 to 90 homes across the two villages over the plan period, from the allocations, from permissions and completions to date, and from future windfalls. So it was a more general point around that. There will still be development that might help sustain the schools in the longer term. Clearly they're sustainable to a point at the moment off the existing pupil numbers. So I'm not aware there's any sort of particular numerical requirement anyone can hang their hat on to say that is needed to ensure the schools are sustainable in the future. And I think on the point Mr. Proietti was, or going back to the point Mr. Proietti was making, obviously he said on the information we've got at the moment, clearly there's not a need for the reserve school site, but you can, essentially I guess the point he's making is you can only model so much. We'll only know the reality when any houses are built and people move in and occupy it. But I think from what he's saying, it would appear that BK3 does put Barkway and Barley on the cusp of the existing schools being able to accommodate their need. It can be accommodated on the modelling, but if there's any significant excess over what the model says, then there may be an issue, and that could raise issues in itself, in that obviously we've talked about nursery reception year 1 being in Barkway, but that's a very constrained site, and if you have a bulge in any particular year group, you may again have to further redistribute the arrangements to accommodate that. Or if the need for the reserve school site is triggered, as I said at the outset, if that federation remains, then you're potentially taking the provision out of Barley is one scenario, and in effect you're using a sledgehammer to crack a nut then, because you're delivering 140 homes in Barkway from BK3, but the 250 odd homes in Barley could be worse off. And I appreciate we don't know any of that until it's built, but it does seem that BK3 is on the margins of what can be accommodated. To pick up on a few of the other points, I mean, obviously I appreciate Mr. Aspinall has raised a number of questions, but this is about furnishing you with the information you need to make a decision rather than necessarily addressing everything. He raises point by point, but yes, it is rural area beyond the green belt. We're talking about outside the village boundary. BK3 is wholly outside the village boundary at the moment, and BK2 is part in and part out. And I think any detailed points about where the pupils come from would be for Mr. Priority, if that was something you felt you needed to know, sir. If he's able to answer that.
So I'm just looking, is he still with us?
Mr. Aspinall appears to have disappeared from my screen. Oh, he's back.
Mr. Priority, I mean.
Oh no, Mr. Priority's here on my screen.
Oh yes, I have him now.
I don't know why I've disappeared from your screen, but I've not been here since I last asked you. I'm not on my screen.
I can see you, Mr. Aspinall.
Well, then that's all that matters. Am I speaking?
Yes, I heard you loud and clear then.
But did you invite me to speak?
No, no. We were just picking up on, Mr. Smith was just picking up on the questions that you had asked.
Yes, and I hope there is going to be an answer to about the Indigenous children and whether the Hertfordshire County Council have got it in their plan to merge the schools. And since they've said that the land is not going to be built on, what they're going to do with it? Sell it for building? And if I can just say to you, if I was a parent in Barkway and you were putting my child or my grandchild under the age of 10 on a bus to go from one school to another, I'd find that to be high risk. It's not a health and safety practice that should be adopted, frankly, in this modern society. But it doesn't say that that should stop the development of these houses on BK3.
Mr. Priority, if you can shed any light on the issue about whether the children at these schools are village residents.
Yes, sir. So the majority of the children who attend Barkway and Barley First schools live within those two parishes.
I've got to come back on that, Mr. Barclay. The majority.
Very briefly, because what I've done, Mr. is I've drawn a line under this now. So I was hearing the council's responses, but just very, very briefly.
Well, majority, what does majority mean? 75% and 25% are from outside the villages, or what?
Sorry, sir. So I believe the figures are certainly over 50%. So a majority of those children live within those two parishes.
Okay, Mr. Smith. You're muted, Mr. Smith.
Apologies. No, I had no further specific points I was going to come back on and say, unless there were specific points you needed, sir, to reach your decision.
You'll bear with me just one moment. I don't have any further questions or anything that I need to pick up on. So I'm now going to take a break for lunch. And when we come back, we will go on to issue 30.3 and 30.4 in the first instance, and that is about Barkway's place within the settlement hierarchy. I have to say, I think that has been touched on quite heavily by a number of people already. So I'm not anticipating that being a tremendously lengthy discussion. I'm going to resume at 2 o'clock, but can I just check with Mrs. St. John Howe? If I recall correctly, I think that we are supposed to actually leave this meeting and then use the invitation to return. Have I got that right, Louise?
No, there is actually a separate invitation for this afternoon.
Yes, that's what right. Okay, so use a separate invitation to join this afternoon at 2 o'clock.
Exactly. So leave this meeting and join with the new invitation.
I was just going to say, if everyone's the same this afternoon, we can use the same meeting if it's easier. Just to throw it out there as well.
I suspect that might create slightly less work for you. So on that basis, then I'll say to everyone that's perfect. We can in fact just stay in this meeting. So as during the previous adjournment, rather than please don't leave the meeting, but please do switch off your microphone and also your camera so that we can't see enviously what it is that you're having for lunch. So it's now 11 minutes past 1. I adjourn the hearing to resume at 2 o'clock. Thank you.